Hello and welcome to this interview session. Today we have the pleasure to receive Dr. Chiedu Osakwe, who is the Director of Accessions at the World Trade Organization. Dr. Osakwe held several positions within the WTO, from Special Coordinator for LDCs to Chairman of the Interagency Working Group for Integrated Framework. He also served at the permanent missions of Nigeria to the UN, as well as the World Trade Organization. He was appointed in 2010 by former President Goodluck Jonathan as ambassador in situ. He wrote extensively on WTO issues, and one of his research work is the WTO Accessions and Trade Multilateralism that has been co-authored with Uri Dadouche, who is our senior fellow and also senior associate at Carnegie. Dr. Chiedu, thank you very much for being with us. So my first questions would be more general. It has been 20 years now that the WTO was established in Marrakesh by the Marrakesh Treaty. What would you say it has contributed to the world trade system?
Absolutely. The WTO has done a great job over the past 20 years. There have been considerable achievements in the area of the three pillars of work of the organization: regular work, dispute settlement, negotiations, including in the area where I currently work, which is the area of multilateral negotiations in regular work. That is the enlargement of the organization. As you know, our current Director General, Roberto Azevedo, has worked extremely hard since he became Director General. We now have had, more recently, two successful ministerial conferences, the one in Bali in 2013 that brought into existence a trade facilitation agreement, and now in Nairobi, just in December of last year, historic agreements on agriculture, the information technology agreement, a package for least developed countries. And in the area in which I'm working currently, over the past 20 years, we have had 36 new economies, countries, if you like, joining the WTO. So there is considerable progress, but there's still much to be done. There is a lot to be done, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to talk about some of these areas. So progress, but it's never enough, and there's always scope for more.
On accessions, for instance, what did it bring in this whole context?
What WTO accessions have done fundamentally, I think that we can narrow it down to four areas. One, the results of 20 years of accessions have basically contributed to updating the rules of the organization in a range of areas: state trading enterprises, intellectual property, the regulatory areas of TBT, SPS. So it has assisted enormously in updating the rules of the system. Related to this area of updating the rules of the system is that it has helped in the jurisprudential development of the organization, if you like. In no less than 20 cases that have come before the WTO dispute settlement system, there have been references, citations, or invocations to WTO accession protocols. A second area where accession has been of enormous help and contribution, not because I say so, but because the governments that have acceded have made this point, is that accession negotiations have provided these new governments with an instrument for domestic reforms, things that they would normally do but they're able to do it on a multilateral platform and to pursue legislation-based domestic reforms. A third area where WTO accessions have contributed is the expansion in market access opportunities, creation of improvement in welfare. I think probably the most striking example is in 1995, the coming into force of the organization of the WTO. There were 123 members, and our rules at the time covered only about 80% of the global economy. 20 years after, this has been radically expanded through improvements in market access via WTO, via accession rules, and we now have WTO rules covering 98% of the global economy. Of course, there's still work to be done. So there have been significant improvements in market access. If you look at tariff bindings, simple tariff bindings, there's 100% coverage in tariff bindings by the new members. If you look at average tariff bindings in the area of goods, for example, for original members, a final bound average tariff rates stand at about 45% for all products, whereas for the Article 12 members, that is our jargon for those who negotiated their membership, the average final bound rates for their commitments in the area of goods stands at 13%. It's even better in the area of agriculture services. There has been radical expansion in the obligations and commitments by the new members. So in terms of market access opportunities, WTO accessions have radically, very significantly improved market access. And you can see in this particular regard, sometimes numbers, when they are aggregated, can be deceptive. But there were significant contributions as a result of the accession of China. Even in terms of the geostrategic complications, there have been improvements in market access by as a result of the accession of the Russian Federation, Saudi Arabia, Kazakhstan, that became a member of the WTO last year. Now, one final area with regard to contributions from WTO accessions is that the results of 20 years indicate that those who have negotiated their membership have used the result of WTO accessions to foster more agreeable bilateral relationships, improve their regional relationships, and as a result foster broader international cooperation. And here I should say that one of the priorities of WTO Director General Azevedo in coming into office is that he has repeatedly stressed the point that he would like to use trade to foster international cooperation and to promote greater peace and security. I think the results from WTO accessions have been considerable, but our work is not done. We still have about 19 economies that are working parties and that are negotiating their membership, and there is still a lot of work to be done, even if they only total 2% of the global economy.
You mentioned the WTO dispute settlement body, which I have to say is a very unique international body for settling commercial disputes between countries. There are many cases that have gone through. How would you assess its achievements nowadays?
Remarkable, absolutely phenomenal. I think what has been achieved by members in setting up the dispute settlement system, what it's coming into force as a result of the dispute settlement understanding brought into force by the Marrakesh Agreement, is that one of the most, probably the most powerful and influential system of dispute settlement and public international law was established. In many ways, it's the foundation of the system. It's what guarantees that members shall not discriminate in their trading relationships. It's what guarantees that the rules of the global economy shall be enforceable. It is what guarantees security in market access, predictability, ensures transparency. It was only last year, I believe, that we reached the milestone, the organization reached the milestone of 500 cases that came before the dispute settlement system. It is a system that members should be very proud of. We in the Secretariat are extremely proud of. But here, nonetheless, a couple of caveats. The WTO functions on three legs. One is the dispute settlement system, which by all accounts and all assessments is working exceptionally well, influential, probably, as I said, one of the best in public international law. And then we have, and this is the equivalent, if you compare it in some ways to national systems, this is the equivalent of the judiciary. And then you have the regular work of the organization that is expressed through the workings of the committees, a multitude of them. Committee on SPS, TBT, customs valuation, import licensing, rules of origin, you name them. But then you have also the legislative angle, the legislative pillar. And this really, in essence, is the negotiating pillar. And the point to be made, I think, in a sense, in concluding on this particular aspect to your question, is that for harmony, for balance, for sustainability, and the integrity of the entire rules-based trading system, all three pillars have to stand strong. They have to function well so that there is an equilibrium and a sustainability in the system. And this is a point that Roberto Azevedo, the Director General, has emphasized repeatedly, that the organization, members and its secretariat, cannot afford or be in a position where we allow a part of this tripod to be weak or atrophy or not function optimally, because it would affect the workings of other parts of the system. We cannot, for example, rest on the oars of the rules that were made as a consequence of the Doha round. And this is why there's optimism would be the word. There was celebration, guardedly, but justifiably, as a result of the outcomes from Bali in the trade facilitation agreement, which is rapidly, as a result of the ratification process, hopefully should come into force this year, and also a deep satisfaction with several of the historic outcomes from Nairobi. So our dispute settlement system works well, exceptionally well. a tribute to the system and guarantees the results and they're key from the system. But it cannot function alone, and it's never functioned alone. And this is why at every opportunity we explain to the wider trade policy community that the WTO should be seen as, in a sense, it's a story of two institutions. On the one hand, the WTO is an economic policy institution. On the other hand, it's also a law-based, a rules-based institution. It's not one or the other. It's not either or. It has to work both as an economic policy institution and as a system that is rules-based, in other words, based on the rule of law.
So the Doha process is struggling, and as a consequence, many observers argue in favor of more plurilateralism. What would you say in this regard?
I think that, listen, from where I sit or where I stand, I think that we should put the challenges and the struggles and the Doha round in context. Things that happen in real time in trade negotiations, we should look at them as part of a long-run series of events. Trade negotiations are tough negotiations. They've never been easy. Right from 1947. Remember that from 1947 to 1994 in Marrakesh, the GATT existed, but only as a protocol of provisional application. So essentially for that period of time, the GATT was being run as a temporary protocol of application. But there were significant achievements. The second thing I'll say apropos the Doha round is all our past trade rounds, all 8 of them, they've contributed to the acquis of the organization and to the rules of the trading system and improved market access. But I think we should also be clear that there has been no round, no trade round that has ever achieved the entirety of its mandate. It's always been work in progress. There are things that have been carried over to other trade rounds, and trade rounds in many ways have been seen as work in progress. And many of the questions that we're taking up in succeeding or subsequent rounds, like trade remedies that came out of the Tokyo codes, have been always have been part of a built-in agenda. Now, there have been challenges significant in the Doha round. It's lasted for a long time, much longer than anyone wanted. But out of it, you have the trade facilitation agreement. Out of it, to a large extent, you had the transparency mechanism on regional trading arrangements. Out of it, you've had the historic successes in Nairobi. From it, in some way, you've had the plurilateral developments with the government procurement agreement and in its conversion and addition, the information technology agreement. And so trade negotiations have to be seen for what they are. They are tough negotiations, not just at the multilateral level. They're also tough negotiations domestically within countries. They take place in a range of configurations. There are bilateral negotiations, Some of the negotiations take place in polygonic arrangements, trilateral, quadrilateral, plurilateral, in other words. So I think it's important to avoid the headline sensationalism about the nature of trade negotiations. They're always tough. There is a domestic component to them. Legislatures in a range of countries are involved. Eventually for them, when agreements are reached and negotiations are concluded, they are subject to processes of ratification before they come into force. And so with this background, to your concrete question on the format of negotiations in the Doha round versus the plurilateral configuration of negotiations, it's always been a mixture. It's always been a combination. What is important is that there is a process of transparency. All members will never be involved in terms of the critical mass of the substance of trade negotiations as any other. The interests of members will rise. They will depend. They will be configured at different levels of commercial interest. For some members, some issues will be more important than other members. But what is critical is that there is an understanding that trade negotiations have always, it is not new, have always taken place in different formats and configurations. One explanation for the systemic success that has been achieved in accession negotiations is because virtually all the negotiations that we have in the area of accessions take place in different formats. Bilateral negotiations that are confidential, plurilateral, in many sense clearing exercises, with eventually multilateral endorsement of it. And they are accepted. The totality of our membership accept the spectrum of negotiating formats and configuration in the area of accessions. And remember what accession negotiations are. They are actually multilateral negotiations, but not in launched trade rounds, in the regular work of the organization. So the Doha round is where it is. There was considerable success of historic proportions in Nairobi. Our members are now in a period of reflection regarding the way forward. But to conclude on the note of plurilateralism that you raise, the idea, and I think that this is a point that a think tank like the OCP Policy Center, which is doing absolutely remarkable work, not just in the area of the Maghreb, but in Africa. A point that you have to help us disseminate is that plurilaterals have always been part of the way the organization has done its work. The GPA is a plurilateral agreement. The Civil Aircraft Agreement is a plurilateral agreement. The Information Technology Agreement 1 and 2 are plurilateral agreements. So there is nothing irreligious or unspeakable or demonic about plurilateral agreements. But I think the point that needs to be made, and the point that several of our members are making, is that in a under multilateralism, there should be a multilateral cover to a large extent of these plurilateral agreements, and that is a fair point as well. But it's vital, it's absolutely critical that there's an understanding that there will be many roads, there will be different roads to travel, as long as the terminal, the final, the end point is the same, that members support and agree to.
Actually, this brings me to another question, but still on the same topic. You're a Nigerian from Africa, and you've also coordinated the WTO African Group in '95. So do you think that African countries would be more in favor of plurilateralism as an alternative, maybe to multilateralism? Would you say?
I'm in the WTO Secretariat as an international civil servant. I coordinated, you're right, you're absolutely right. I coordinated the African group in 1995 from July to December, the first year of the organization. And I'm not sure if you know, but the first coordinator of the African group was a Moroccan, Mr. Lesheb, a dear friend of mine. We've lost touch over many years. He was the first coordinator when we set up the African group in 1995. He coordinated it from January to June, and then I took it up from July to December of 1995. The group has evolved. They're close to, not quite sure of the specific number, but there are almost 40 African countries that are now members of the WTO. In many areas, there's an overlap of interests. In some other areas, there is, and for all the logical reasons in the world, these are different sovereign entities. There are differences, different areas of emphasis, if you like. They would have to determine their position. Others will not tell them, non-African members will not tell them how to proceed. But what I would say to you on your specific question are the following 3 points. The Nairobi Ministerial Conference was probably one of our most successful and historic ministerial conferences. And to a large extent, the success of Nairobi and the success that was achieved in Nairobi was in large measure because the African countries, members of the WTO, gave their support and worked in partnership with several of the major economies, the United States, the European Union, China, India, and several others, and gave strong support to the Director General, Roberto Azevedo, of the organization, who worked very closely and harmoniously in very good partnership with the Cabinet Secretary, the Kenyan Cabinet Secretary, Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Trade, Amina Mohammed. So they now have a history. The African members of the WTO now have a history of a successful ministerial conference that was held on the African continent. Stay with me, I would not underestimate the impetus and the momentum that would be injected by the African group coming out of Nairobi, that they succeeded in Nairobi because they were pragmatic, and that they'll be able to continue on with this. A second point I'll make is there's a period of reflection underway in the WTO. I will not interpret a period of reflection. I will not try to read the minds of negotiators and members. But my sense is that there is a great degree of pragmatism underway. And part of the reason this is happening is there are, in my view, positive, competitive pressures from liberalization activities underway in mega-regionalism, FTAs and PTAs of various support, of various types and categories, and members, including members of the African group, understand clearly that they have to be part of a process that's pragmatic, of an organization, the WTO, that is delivering constantly, not irrelevant, but contemporaneous, delivering, and at the frontier of rulemaking, in consolidating a rules-based, interdependent global economy that is delivering significant welfare benefits in the aggregate, and also for individual economies. They will have to decide on how they proceed, but for a group that has many members, I think the eventual position should not be second-guessed. And advice that I have given privately, including here, is for dialogue with the group, engagement with the group, inputs from serious think tanks like the OCP Policy Center and a range of others. It's important that the group engages, and there is engagement with the group in ways that are objective and that have a real connection to a global economy that delivers welfare benefits for all its members.
So you pointed out few challenges that the countries face during the negotiations. And given the many difficulties actually of Doha, can we say the WTO is dead today?
Absolutely not. The WTO is an indispensable organization. If it did not exist, it would be created. I think this is a fundamental point that needs to be made. Is it possible to imagine a world without the WTO? Look, perhaps just a few points. We can think about the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in terms of market access. And there, from 1947 to currently, it's been associated with improvements in welfare and prosperity in the global economy. Take away the period of 2008-2009 global financial and economic crisis and the collapse of trade, but it helped to mitigate. The seriousness of what could have been tit for tat and highly destructive protectionist measures. So at the level of market access, it's delivered. At the level of providing rules in an interdependent global economy, it remains indispensable. Thirdly, think about where individual economies, members of the WTO, would be without an organization that provides for the relationship between members on a non-discriminatory basis. One of the most powerful reasons why the WTO remains indispensable. If we go back to the origins of the GATT 47, we have to remember the real raison d'etre for the establishment of the GATT, the predecessor of the WTO. It was about international cooperation, a forum and a platform that would prevent countries from tit-for-tat policies, beggar-thy-neighbor policies, those policies that sent the world to war as a consequence of the Great Depression. So look at the WTO again in terms of a principal forum for international cooperation, for promoting peace and security, and for fostering relationships at different levels, bilateral level, plurilateral level, and multilateral. The WTO is actually more than trade. One of the things I do say regularly to my friends, what is it that the WTO represents in the world today? Let's think about it in more architectural terms. It's actually an expression of parliamentary democracy, of the methodology of rulemaking through questions and answers, of transparency, of good governance, of open and clean governments, of the rule of law. And above all, remember that it represents the WTO. It represents the market economy that provides that model of economic functioning to which all the countries that came out of the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union, a failed economic system, and the unraveling of the former Yugoslavia, all the countries in transition that were moved into the market economy. The WTO represents that objective, their objective, and provided the instrument for that movement from an economic system that failed, clearly failed, through a transition period, some of it still underway, to the market economy. It's not an exaggeration to say that the World Trade Organization is your indispensable organization. If the WTO did not exist, it would have to be created.
Thank you very much for your time and your clarifications. Maybe to conclude, would you like to give us a few words on your book and the main findings?
Well, in almost 1,000 pages, specifically 973 pages, Uri Dadush, my co-editor, we assembled 53 other contributors and wrote up 41 chapters that answer basically 4 questions. 1, what is the process of WTO accession? 2, over a 20-year period between 1995 and 2015, what are the results from WTO accessions? Thirdly, what are the most important lessons that we have learned from accession negotiations and their results? And number 4, finally, if you like, what are the challenges? Can it be improved? And what is the relationship to the development priorities of countries? In summarizing the answer, in short, I think what is probably more critical is that the contributors span the spectrum. You have the chief negotiators of original members that negotiated with the chief negotiators of the acceding governments, now the new members. You have representatives from think tanks, like Uri from Carnegie. We invited contributions from our colleagues and counterparts in sister organizations like the World Bank and the IMF. We got the perspectives of chairpersons of WTO accession working parties that manage and preside over the process. And then there were professional colleagues within the WTO Secretariat who contributed in our search for answers to these 4 or 5 questions. And the consensus was clear. 1, WTO accession is one of the most successful stories in the organization. Results from accessions have consolidated the system, taking it forward, strengthening the rules, improved access to markets, and fostered relationship, but above all, given the acceding governments an instrument for domestic reforms. And the results from accessions have helped to disseminate and gain acceptance of the WTO core values that you and I talked about, Isan, a few moments ago, the core values of transparency, open and clean governments, good governance, the rule of law, and commitments to the market, an interdependent global market economy. This is a consensus that's been established by a range of contributors, so in no way orchestrated, but coming from their own individual analysis. What the contributors have said is the template that we use for WTO accession is a viable and reliable and tested model for trade development based on domestic reforms.
Well, this sounds all very good, and again, thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to receiving you soon again. Thank you.
Thank you.